If you know me, or you've ever watched my videos before, you know that I love history. But what you might not know is that I also love movies and shows. I'm always working on finishing a TV show, and I've always got a movie on my horizon. So when the Netflix original The Last Tsar came across my screen, I was intrigued. I remember being a really big fan of the first season of Marco Polo when that came out, but I'm also a bit skeptical because those years of high-quality Netflix are long gone. Now, I know a lot of history buffs tend to be the actually when history comes across the screen, which I'm sure they would have found plenty wrong with the trailer alone, but I prefer to enjoy a good thing when it comes my way. It probably also helps that I personally know very little about Russian history. And with that naivete, my watch begins. And in order to avoid copyright degeneracy, I will be limiting how much of the actual show's material I put in the video. So I apologize. One of the first things I notice when I start the show is how good it looks, which Netflix has never disappointed on its visual quality, at least for me personally. Early into the show, we are presented with a scene, the royal viewing of the newly deceased Tsar Alexander III. During this scene, we are introduced to the members of the royal family and the people we'll be following in this show. We are also introduced in this scene to the history documentary style commentary that they've decided to overlay along with the traditionally drama acted scenes. This unusual mechanic, in theory and initially, it's not such a big deal, it's not so bad. While it's not so bad, it definitely stops the show from being enjoyed like a proper drama, because it always seeks to pull you back. And not long after the commentary starts, does it start to become a real problem. This fellow named Simon describes the Tsar position as Field Marshal, Prime Minister, Pope, and Emperor all wrapped into one. The other guy describes it as a medieval-style monarchy where the Tsar has ultimate control over everything. They've both got this tone like this is somehow like a unique thing or like a big deal. Now, I don't know about the Pope part of all that, but what they just described is a pretty standard monarchy, which in European history up to this point has been the default form of government for most European nations. Then one of the commentators says, "What man in the world could possibly be qualified for such a post?" Which, I mean, most of Europe is in a monarchy at this point, so a lot of people. 13 minutes in and we are introduced to the infamous Rasputin. It's at this point as well that the language of the show becomes an issue. You see, everyone on the show speaks English, which is fine when you're talking about the nobility, but you see the actor who plays Rasputin, as well as the other peasants in the town, speak with a sort of rural, lower-class Anglo accent, which, unfortunately, is an accent I very much place in England. So it kind of ruins the setting of the deeply Russian rural landscape. 18 minutes into the show, and we are introduced to the uncle of Tsar Nicholas II, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. The commentators introduce him as dogmatic and extremely right-wing. What exactly does right-wing mean in this context? Remember, this is a monarchy. What these words like right-wing and left-wing mean is very different from our modern democracies. And unfortunately, the show doesn't really help us with that. I gather that they want this to mean that he is against some of the liberalizing measures that other European nations are going through at this time. But I'm very concerned that that's not what they mean. I'm concerned what they mean is he is in favor of the monarchy, which is one of these modern idiocies where it's actually the up and down part of the political compass, but is also, at the time period, a very normal political position to hold. This scene also is the coronation speech for Tsar Nicholas II. And with this scene, the commentators place a sort of symbolic crossroads where, I quote, "Embrace modernity and democracy like Western Europe, or he can choose to remain an absolute monarchy." I'm not really a fan of this line, as it presumes to place democracy as inherently superior and the future to monarchy. It places monarchy as inherently primitive. Now remember, hindsight is 2020, and we know now that democracy wins out in the end and becomes the standard form of government. But at the time, people would have not seen it in such simple terms. It is true that there was a choice to be made, which many of the powers in Europe were doing. But what I do not appreciate is this modern sentiments and interpretations these people paint onto history. Now, Tsar Nicholas II states that he will hold and affirm the principles of autocracy. The commentators then say that, oh, this is a huge mistake, that this is the choice that causes his demise, that this blocks any opportunity for reform, which again is something you can only say with the grace of 2020 hindsight. We know how the story ends, but of course, Tsar Nicholas II giving his coronation speech certainly does not. As I said, many European nations had to make this choice between democracy or monarchy, which Tsar Nicholas, choosing monarchy and not to democratize, was very much not alone in the European community. While Nicholas II might not have been interested in reform, it certainly doesn't mean he was blocked from doing it. You see, one of those funny little perks about absolute monarchy is anything you say goes. So every day, Tsar Nicholas II can make that choice. Every day he feels like it. The show switches back to Rasputin, who has been exiled from his village and is now on a pilgrimage to find God. Both Rasputin and us, the viewer, are introduced to the sect, the Khalisti, which apparently translates to the Whips. The show says that they are illegal and that they operate in secret. The commentators state that these people engage in orgies and cut off and eat the breasts of virgins. To which, I mean, if you're at the point of believing that someone would do that, let me guess, Jews eat babies too? To the point, does that description sound like the truth? Or does it perhaps sound like how someone else would describe them? Like, say, the state that made them illegal? I find this is the most offensive part in the show, since it really shows their hand. It shows they're not terribly interested in giving you a full and healthy view of history. After this point, I don't really have any play-by-plays of what they're doing wrong. But like I said, I don't personally know much about Russian history, to which I would certainly encourage one of you in the audience to take your Russian knowledge and dissect this show to pieces. Watching the show gave me the feeling that they had filmed a normal drama, but I don't know, maybe like test audiences didn't like it very much, so what they did was they got a bunch of guys, made some history commentary, slapped it on top so that it would feel like a documentary, and that way audiences would be more, I don't know, lenient on it. But the problem is, the commentary is bringing it all down. It's not exactly History Channel level commentary. It's not Joe Schmo and his secret alien history of rectal examinations. Some of these commentators have PhDs, so there is that. But there's nothing that they really say that adds anything to a scene that they are intruding in. Show, do not tell. I'm sure mechanically it's probably very useful for emphasizing and setting tone in a given scene, but I mean, there's no reason a couple extra lines of dialogue couldn't do the same. Which, given that, you could have just scrapped the entire mechanic altogether and streamlined the show. But I suspect that they really wanted that filler, that baking soda, into the show. All in all, the show looks pretty. Netflix has never struggled with that. And I did enjoy the parts of the show where it was being a drama, but the commentary just wasn't pulling its weight. Which, I mean, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the pure offense that they do onto history, which I'm sure if one of my more experted kin were to take a look at this, they would find much to be desired.